Good day. The last 24 hours in the conflict in Ukraine have been dominated in terms of the media headlines and the reporting by Ukrainian as opposed to Russian actions. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russians have been doing a great deal. There are dribbles of reports about the Russians continuing to advance in the Kupiansk area. I read somewhere that they're advancing between 500 and 600 meters a day in the area around Kupiansk. Of course, the closer they get to the built-up areas of Kupiansk itself, inevitably, the slower their advance becomes. But anyway, clearly the Russians are continuing their push towards Kupiansk and further south towards the Oskol River line. But we had actually heard it less about it over the course of the last 24 hours. And the reason is because it is Ukraine that has been making the big moves. And firstly, there was a major Ukrainian attack on the Zaporozhye front lines from Orechov towards Rabotino. And there's also been a mass drone attack on Crimea. Now, let's deal firstly with the attack on Rabotino, which has gained a great deal of attention. In fact, last night and this morning, the media were absolutely full with this story. And I would add that there's been repeated reports, especially on the internet, appearing on Twitter, that the Ukrainians have finally managed to capture Rabotino. There's one by Rob Lee, who says the following. He says this was said yesterday, late on afternoon yesterday. Deep State Channel updated its map to show Ukraine has liberated Rabotino. They credit the 47th, 65th, 116th, 117th, 118th, 71st, 46th, and 82nd Brigades, the Scala Battalion, the 78th Regiment, the 73rd Centre, the 3rd NGU, I'm not sure what an NGU is, by the way, and the 14th Brigade as having fought in the area. That is an astonishing collection of military units. The Moon of Alabama says that that's about 10 brigades, 10 plus brigades, that it would be somewhere between 20 to 35,000 men, though I should make it clear that it's not suggested that all of these units were attacking Rabotino simultaneously. I think that the Deep State Channel is talking about an attack on Rabotino, the attacks on Rabotino that have been underway ever since the second week of June. Anyway, this Deep State Channel, with its map, has shown Rabotino under Ukrainian control. And I did think for a time that that was probably what had actually happened. A vast, massive attack by Ukraine, which finally rolled through the Russian defenses in Rabotino and finally captured the village. And there were reports, I remember last night, that as many as 83 armored vehicles were attacking towards Rabotino simultaneously. These are Ukrainian armored vehicles. I remember reading also that the major point of the Ukrainian attack was not Rabotino itself, but an area to the east of Rabotino, open fields to the east of Rabotino, where Ukraine has been trying to push forward in order to sever road links leading to Rabotino and to outflank the Russian defenders there. Apparently these open fields have been occupied for some time by small groups of Ukrainian soldiers that have infiltrated in them. The Russians don't have significant defences there, though there are apparently minefields. But now mechanized units of the Ukrainian army rolled into these fields and were trying to carry out some kind of envelopment operation. And as I said, everything suggested as of late last night that Rabotino, a village which apparently had 480 inhabitants before the war, or at least that was what the last Ukrainian census apparently said, that Rabotino, after this colossal effort, had finally been captured by Ukraine. By the way, Vladimir Rogov, the official of the Russian-appointed Zaporozhye regional government, says that since the beginning of August, Ukraine has lost, in terms of killed and severely wounded, around 1,000 men trying to capture Rabotino. Well, that was last night. This morning there was still reports of fighting for Rabotino. They spoke about the village being divided between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Ukrainians apparently allegedly controlled 2/3 of it. The Russians were clinging on to the southern outskirts. And then the day wore on, and as of the time of making this video, it's started to seem as if Ukraine has not so far managed to capture Rabotino. It could even be the case that they've been pushed back in a few places. They appear to have suffered again enormous losses. Much of their equipment, many of their men have been destroyed by Russian artillery fire, which is extremely heavy. The Russian Air Force has also been in heavy operation in the area. I suspect the Kamov 52 helicopter gunships, the so-called alligator helicopter gunships, have been active as well. And anyway, so far, it's starting to look as if Rabotino has still not been captured by Ukraine, and that those reports that were circulating earlier that it had been were wrong. Now, let me say again, I am not on the scene. I'm not able to provide on-the-spot information about what is taking place. But it does seem, once more, as if Ukraine is committing vast resources to capture a single small village which is not even integrated in Russia's major fortified defense lines, which lie to the south of it. And once more, they seem to be stumbling to try to capture that village, and they seem to be suffering very heavy losses as they attempt to capture the village. And there does seem to be, from what I can see, a difference in priorities. The Ukrainian priority, the Ukrainian objective in all of this fighting is to capture Rabotino. They need to capture Rabotino if they're to advance beyond Rabotino to the major Russian fortified lines, and beyond that to Tokmak, the big town somewhere to the south. And then they need to capture Tokmak if they're going to move on, press on towards the even bigger and more important town of Melitopol. And then they need to capture Melitopol with all its heavy defences if they're then to press on still further and reach finally the Sea of Azov, cutting off the Russian land bridge. So there is a military rationale to the need to capture Rabotino. But I'm starting to get the sense that after more than 2.5 months of intense fighting, capturing Rabotino for the Ukrainians has become an end in itself. It has been incredibly frustrating to them, to their military command and to their sponsors in the United States and in London, that they have not been able to capture Rabotino up to this point, and therefore they are committing more and more troops from their reserves, some of their best troops, to capture this single village. What began as a battle with a clear tactical objective, looks increasingly like it's become a battle on the Ukrainian side, which is based around an obsession to capture this one village which has defied Ukraine for so long. Now, on the Russian side, I think the thinking is quite different. Obviously, they're not going to give up Rabotino before they must, but the reports suggest that the Russian priority remains not so much retaining Rabotino itself, but rather wreaking as much damage on the Ukrainian military as possible, causing Ukraine's forces to lose as much equipment, as many men as possible, weakening the Ukrainian forces before they finally do reach the Russian front lines, the real fortified front lines, and causing Ukraine to commit its reserves prematurely and to deplete them, and in the words cited by General Surovikin way back in October when he was the overall commander, to grind the Ukrainians down. And that's, to me, how it looks. As I said, Vladimir Rogov says that 1,000 Ukrainian troops have either died or been severely wounded trying to capture this single village. And Belitsky, who is the governor of the Russian-appointed governor of the Russian-controlled part of Zaporozhye region, has actually said that though Ukrainian troops did reach the first Russian fortified line in Rabotino itself, he doesn't mean, I think, the Surovikin line. He means an area of defences within Rabotino, that they were able to reach that area, the trenches there, that more of the Ukrainian troops were destroyed in that effort, and the attack has been repelled. So we see a difference in perspective, an obsession on the one side, a more, shall we say, rational or perhaps calculated approach to the fighting from the other. Anyway, that is the situation in Rabotino. Now, from what I can gather, there have also been more Ukrainian attacks in the Bakhmut area. They do appear to be of a significantly lesser level of intensity than earlier attacks in the Bakhmut area have been. But I have to say, I've seen no signs so far of any great redeployment of Ukrainian troops from the Bakhmut area and transfer of these troops to the Zaporozhye region to support the Ukrainian offensive, the Ukrainian attack from Orekhov towards the Sea of Azov, as Mark Milley and Admiral Radikin and General Karoli were asking of General Zaluzhny a couple of days ago, according to the New York Times. There's nothing so far that suggests anything like that has actually happened. Anyway, there was this attack. It seems to have been pushed back. It appears to have been unsuccessful. Ukraine continues to send troops pushing towards Klesheyevka and Kurdyumovka, these two villages to the southwest of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. But in every case so far, Ukraine has failed to achieve anything of significance, and one starts to get the sense that these attacks have lost conviction. Now, there have been dribbles of reports about events in other parts of the battlefronts, but nothing of any significance that I'm aware of. And I'm going to press on to discuss the other big news that took place, the other big event that took place yesterday, or perhaps I should say more properly, over the course of last night, because it's become increasingly clear that Ukraine has been trying to mirror the enormous Russian drone and missile attacks that had been taking place across Ukraine with some kind of a drone offensive of its own against Russia. So on every night now we see Ukrainian drones trying to reach Moscow, being brought down, or so the Russians claim, principally through electronic jamming, causing superficial damage to some high buildings in Moscow, not having any significant effect on the life of the city, but nonetheless causing a certain significant amount of disruption in the activities of Moscow's airports, which have been affected to some degree. But yesterday, we also saw an attack, so the Russians say, by 42 Ukrainian drones on Crimea, all at the same time. 42 drones sent towards Crimea in an effort to break through Russian defences to cause damage to installations in Crimea. Now, the Russians claim that every one of these drones was brought down either by being shot down or through electronic jamming. Again, I can't confirm this. Ukraine, as far as I'm aware, at least not as of the time of making of this program, has made no specific claim about what these drones have achieved. A couple of days ago, the Ukrainians did make claims and released pictures of what they said was a successful attack on a Russian surface-to-air missile facility. They claimed that it was an S-400 missile complex that had been destroyed. Rybar has partially admitted that this attack did take place, but has challenged the Ukrainian claim that what was destroyed was an S-400 complex. Rybar says that it was only a much less sophisticated, or at least a less sophisticated, S-300 complex that was destroyed. Anyway, 42 drones. It's attracted a great deal of publicity in the media today, what with the failure of Ukraine's various efforts to capture Rabotino. So it's attracted quite a lot of attention in the Western media, the British media. But once more, I get the overall sense that these drones were simply unable to get through, that they did only superficial. They created only superficial problems for the Russians. If any drone did get through, it doesn't seem to have done any real or significant damage. So these Ukrainian attacks, this drone offensive, in which I suspect Ukraine may have had fairly high hopes. They seem to have spent a lot of time mass producing these drones, presumably training operators to operate them, developing pathways to send these drones towards Russia. I suspect that this drone offensive has been a disappointment for Ukraine, in that I can't really see that it's made any real difference either to the Russian war effort or to Russia's political resolve, or indeed to the economic and political and social life of the country. But there we go. One thing I will say about this Ukrainian drone offensive is that, small as these drones are, certainly by comparison with the far more sophisticated drones that the Russians are now operating, not to mention the large numbers of cruise missiles that the Russians are operating. Small as these Ukrainian drones are, I suspect that this is a relatively cheap offensive. It's not something that is absorbing Ukrainian resources to any great extent. And on a sheer cost-benefit calculation basis, the Ukrainians may have decided that more Russian resources are being tied down repelling this Ukrainian drone offensive than Ukraine is using in conducting the drone offensive, and therefore in some way it pays off for Ukraine. And that may be correct, but then of course Russia has far more resources than Ukraine anyway, and I doubt that the resources that it's had to commit to repelling this particular drone offensive is great enough to impact on Russian calculations in any significant way. Anyway, Ukraine isn't just using drones. Earlier in the war, it had successfully converted Soviet-era Strij turbojet-powered reconnaissance drones into cruise missiles and had launched them against targets deep inside Russia. From what I can see, Ukraine has run through its stock of these Strij drones, so it is now resorting to attacks on Russian targets with old S-200 surface-to-air missiles converted into ground strike ballistic missiles, and again it's been launching several of these against Russian targets, and it did so again last night. The Russians claim that they managed to shoot down all of these S-200 missiles that have been launched up to now, and they might very well be right. There's been less word of the use by Ukraine of the British Storm Shadow and French Scalp cruise missiles. Perhaps before long we'll be hearing more about these, but for the moment there's less word about them. Anyway, that was the news yesterday. Intense attempts by Ukraine to capture Rabotino and a drone offensive, which sometimes an individual drone can get through and cause a certain amount of damage, or perhaps even a significant amount of damage if that photo of the burning Tupolev 22M3 bomber in Novgorod turns out to have been genuine after all. If, as Rybar so apparently admits, it is indeed the case that Ukrainian drone did indeed destroy successfully a Russian surface-to-air missile base in Crimea. So occasionally drones do get through and they do carry out some damage on the Russians, but these are pinprick attacks. Overall, they don't seem to be having any real effect on the course of military events whatsoever. So that now brings me to the next piece of news, because we're now getting lots of reports that the Russians are indeed planning some big offensive over the next couple of weeks. And I'm going to take this report from Slavyangrad, which I think brings together all the various reports from all the various people on the Russian side who are hinting or telling us that there's going to be a big offensive soon. And it says this: after Yevgeny Belitsky, of course, is the acting governor of the Russian-appointed part of Zaporozhye region. He recently had a meeting with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. By the way, Putin has been meeting all the leaders of all of the four regions over the last couple of days. We will come to that shortly. But he also met with Belitsky, and Belitsky came away from the meeting dropping hints that Putin is telling him that a Russian offensive is on the way. Anyway, after Yevgeny Belitsky, Abdi Alaudinov, he is the head of the Akhmat Special Forces units, which basically are the Chechen forces fighting principally now in the Bakhmut area, and which have proved some of the most effective units fighting on the Russian side. And Ashra Avidzba, I'm afraid I don't know who this person is. Yuri Podolyaka, now he's a very, very well-known war reporter on the Russian side. He's just visited the Russian front lines. He's spoken to the Russian troops on the front lines. He's issued a report in which he says that he finds that the morale amongst the Russian troops is high, and he says that they all are now saying that the Ukrainian offensive is ebbing and that it won't be sustained for very much longer. But anyway, this report from Slavyangrad says that Ashra Avidzba and Yuri Podolyaka, two now confirmed plans for a major Russian offensive within the next 30 days, maybe earlier. And Podolyaka said that all that's left is for the Ministry of Defense to set a specific date. All preparations are underway. And Slavyangrad makes the point, unlike rumours about a major Russian offensive last winter, this is coming from multiple major sources, three of them official. And the three officials are presumably Belitsky, Alaudinov, and Avidzba, whoever he is. And the Slavyangrad piece then says, in the meantime, the Russian army has managed to hold the line at Rabotino last night, with further major attacks repelled in the early morning and before noon. Ukraine keeps pouring its remaining reserves, trying to break the lines. The importance of Rabotino comes from its geographical position, giving the easiest access to Tokmak if taken. So, rumours now of a big Russian offensive. And going back to an earlier story, the one about Surovikin, there were reports that he's been dismissed as head of the Russian aerospace forces. Many are linking that to the Prigozhin affair, perhaps rightly, who's to say? But given that Surovikin is a combined arms officer, somebody who isn't just an aerospace person, in fact his background is not in the aerospace forces at all, but given that that is so, perhaps just conceivably he has been appointed the operational commander, given the task of leading the troops, perhaps as many as 250,000 of them, if you believe what Lukashenko said to that Ukrainian journalist a short time ago. The Russian troops who will be participating in this presumed offensive, if it really does take place at some point over the next month. Now this is, by the way, an interesting timing, because it would suggest that the Russians are prepared to launch an offensive during the period of the Rasputitsa. They have tracked vehicles, apparently better adapted to the conditions of the Rasputitsa than the Western armoured vehicles that Ukraine uses. But anyway, we'll see whether any of that is true and whether it really is going to take place at some point over the course of the next 30 days, or whether it will take place a little later, or indeed whether it's even planned at all. But anyway, that's the word that is now coming out, that there is a major Russian offensive being prepared. possible location for that offensive, maybe in the north, maybe in Kharkiv region, maybe the Kupiansk advance, the advance towards the Oskol, is a shaping operation to prepare for that offensive, which may be coming. But anyway, we shall just have to wait and see. We don't yet know what the Russians are actually preparing or proposing to do, but it is a case that senior people, including one military commander, Abdi Alaudinov, are now talking about a Russian offensive, a big Russian offensive, being in the works. And that brings me to two further points. I said that Yuri Podolyaka has been saying that some Russian soldiers that he's been speaking to, Russian soldiers on the front lines, are telling him that they sense that Ukraine's offensive is ebbing. Russian commentaries about the fighting in Rabotino are all saying essentially the same thing, that the current attacks on Rabotino by Ukraine are the last spasm of this offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, before it finally runs through its course, before it's finally exhausted itself. That Ukraine is committing its last remaining significant reserves to trying to capture Rabotino, that if it fails to capture Rabotino, or even if it does capture Rabotino, but at the kind of high price that it is suffering at the moment, it won't have more reserves or more resources to push through later. And again, there's been lots of discussion, lots of commentary in various Russian sources, in various places, in the Russian internet and amongst Russian journalists and commanders about what happened 80 years ago in the Battle of Kursk. Now, just to repeat again, the Battle of Kursk, a titanic battle, one of the greatest battles of the Second World War, was a battle which came about as a result of an offensive, the last big German offensive on the Eastern Front, which was launched by the Germans in July 1943. And the idea behind this offensive was to encircle and break the Red Army in an area salient, an area projecting in front of the front lines in the central regions of Russia, the Soviet Union, around the town of Kursk. Not very far, by the way, from where some of the existing fighting is taking place. And the Germans launched this offensive, but it took them months to prepare. And in the meantime, Soviet intelligence got wind of the plans that the Germans had. And so the Russians created these enormous, elaborate fortified lines in Kursk around the area of this salient. So when the German offensive came, the Red Army was ready. It had created 3 lines of defences. It had laid around 500,000 landmines. It had built trenches and fortifications and barbed wire and pillboxes and anything that you can imagine. Concentrated large numbers of men and tanks to defend these front lines against this German offensive. And eventually, the German offensive began to run out of steam. And when it did, the Red Army had built up huge reserves and it launched them into a counteroffensive, and that counteroffensive, in effect, marked the decisive turning point of the Second World War, at least on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, the Soviets were consistently on the attack, the Germans were consistently on the defense. So that's the Battle of Kursk, and it's been widely commemorated in Russia today. And just a few days ago, Putin himself gave an address commemorating the Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk. Well, he didn't perhaps draw exact parallels, but the fact that he attended an entire event commemorating the Battle of Kursk and gave a speech there is perhaps an indication of this itself. And one other person has apparently referenced the Battle of Kursk, and that person is none other than General Zaluzhny, the overall commander of Ukraine's armed forces. And he seems to have said this over the course of a difficult video conference with US officials. Now, I'm getting all this from the Wall Street Journal, and I'm not sure, but I suspect that this was the same meeting that was recently discussed in the New York Times, the one which was attended by Mark Milley and General Karolyi and Admiral Radekin of Britain. And what we learned from the New York Times over the course of that was that over the course of that meeting, the US, the Western officials, pressed Zaluzhny to end immediately the Ukrainian offensive towards Bakhmut, to redeploy the Ukrainian troops who were committed to that offensive in Bakhmut to the Zaporozhye front lines, to get them to launch a massive attack from Orekhov through presumably Rabotino to Tokmak and Melitopol and all of those places. And according to the New York Times, Zaluzhny agreed, despite the fact that the Western officials apparently conceded that the cost would be enormous, but they basically said to Ukraine, ignore whatever losses you might experience. You've got to go on fighting and advancing, even if huge numbers of your men get killed. A philosophy, an approach which, as I discussed in my program yesterday, I find beyond callous. But anyway, the New York Times suggested that Zaluzhny agreed to do what the Western leaders were telling him to do. Now, the Wall Street Journal, if of course it is covering the same meeting, tells a rather different story. It has Zaluzhny getting angry and pushing back and telling the Western officials, you don't understand this war. You're thinking about the kind of wars you've been fighting in the Middle East against insurgents and such people. This war in Ukraine is nothing like that. It is like Kursk. So that's supposedly what Zaluzhny said. Now, that suggests that he is getting worried that the events of the Battle of Kursk are repeating themselves, that Ukraine is being pushed constantly as a result of the intense political pressure from the West to go on with its offensive. The result is that more and more Ukrainian soldiers are being killed, more and more Ukrainian soldiers are being wounded, more and more tanks, armoured vehicles are being lost. The shell depletion rate continues at an unsustainable rate. But whenever Zaluzhny comes and tries to explain this to the Western officials, he's told that he must disregard all of that and he must continue with the offensive. And Zaluzhny, who, my impression has been that he has been sceptical about this offensive for months, since long before it started, that he's trying to get the West to understand that what they're doing is putting Ukraine in very great jeopardy, that it is depleting its reserves, its stocks, the stockpiles of ammunition and equipment, and of course its manpower, and as a result, Ukraine is opening itself up to a repeat of what happened at Kursk. Just as the Red Army used the defensive battle it fought at Kursk to grind down the German forces before launching its counterattack with devastating effect upon the Germans, so Ukraine is being ground down before the Russian defences in this offensive, and is opening itself up to a potential devastating Russian counteroffensive when it comes. And the Western officials apparently are simply not accepting this. And that, of course, begs a number of questions. Is it because they are ignorant of the extent of the Russian build-up? Have they fallen for the trap of believing much of their own, I'm going to call it what I think it is, propaganda? That the Russians have run out of reserves, that they don't have enough men and machines, and that their artillery is exhausted and their stocks of shells have almost run out. Is that what they think? That Ukraine can continue with this offensive without risking the kind of pushback from the Russians that the Germans suffered at Kursk because the Russians are too weak to do that? Is that what they think? Or is it perhaps that Western military officials are coming under so much pressure from their political masters, the President of the United States, Jake Sullivan, his National Security Advisor, other officials at the National Security Council and the State Department, that they are simply conveying to the Ukrainians what their political chiefs are telling them to say? Who knows? But if all of these reports from Abdialaudinov and Belitsky and Podolyaka and all the others are true, and a Russian offensive is indeed being prepared for the next 30 days, then one can certainly see how the actions of the Western powers might actually be working to Russia's advantage, that they're helping the Russians grind the Ukrainian forces down, preparing the way for this offensive that the Russians might eventually decide to launch. Well, that's the situation so far on the battlefields. No doubt there'll be an awful lot more going on over the next couple of days. And we'll see what happens in Rabotino, and we'll see what happens when and if the Russians do decide to launch their offensive, though that might be some weeks away. What else has been going on? Now, there's been an awful lot of repercussions, a lot of discussion, continues to be a lot of discussion about the Prigozhin affair. And there's been actually some more information about Prigozhin. The first thing to say is that over the course of a meeting with Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk regional government, Putin spoke about Prigozhin as if he was dead. And I think that we can take that as a very good indication that Prigozhin is indeed dead, and that he was indeed on that particular aircraft that fell from the sky. Now, Putin's spokesman, Peskov, has categorically denied, as he would do, that the Kremlin had any role in the accident that resulted in Prigozhin's death. Now, I've spoken extensively, both on this channel and on the Duran, about my own doubts that the Kremlin was in fact involved in Prigozhin's death. But I'm going to say a number of things about this. Firstly, it is taken as axiomatic in the West that Prigozhin his death was indeed arranged by Putin and by the Kremlin. But the interesting thing about this is that, having previously said that the fact that Prigozhin had been left alive, that he hadn't been arrested or charged or prosecuted or killed previously as a result of his mutiny by the Russian authorities, that was a sign of weakness on the part of Putin and of the Russian authorities. The media, I notice in the West, consistent with that view, is now running with the story that by arranging for Prigozhin's death, by carrying it out in this incredibly theatrical and way, with the plane tumbling down from the skies, that the Kremlin has basically terrified the entire Russian establishment, so that anybody with any doubts in Russia about Putin's leadership and about the war has now been terrorized into obedience. And that may be true, but I will say straight away that I still don't think so, and I set out the various reasons why I doubt it in my previous program. Now, to that set of reasons, I must add certain others. The first is that we've now had some information about what were Prigozhin's activities shortly before he was killed. It turns out that he was indeed in Africa. He visited the Central African Republic. He had a meeting with the president there. He gave assurances to the president of the Central African Republic that despite the events of the events in June in Russia, the coup attempt in Russia, Prigozhin remained in good standing in Russia, and that the Wagner organization would continue to provide the government of the Central African Republic with the security assistance, all the security assistance that it needed. After this meeting with the president of the Central African Republic, Prigozhin had a meeting with representatives of the Sudanese militia that is fighting the Sudanese government. Now, I'm not sure whether this meeting took place in Sudan, or whether it took place in the Central African Republic, or whether it took place in Mali, where Prigozhin, as we'll see, also went. But anyway, he had this meeting with the Sudanese militia. Apparently, the Wagner forces, despite previous denials, have allegedly provided some assistance to the Sudanese militia in the ongoing conflict in which that militia is engaged against the Sudanese army, and the Sudanese militia paid Prigozhin for this, and apparently the payment was allegedly made in gold. And then Prigozhin went up further and he travelled to Mali, where he had meetings with the authorities in Mali, who are also relying upon Wagner, or have been relying upon Wagner, to give them military assistance and to provide them with security. And then at some point over the course of this tour, Prigozhin put on his flak jacket and his helmet, and he did his last video, in which he spoke about how Wagner was back in Africa and would be expanding Russian influence there and would be helping the Africans to throw off the yoke that they suffered for so long. And then, after that, he returned to Russia, where the plane crash took place. Now, I've said previously that I don't think Prigozhin was in any way a threat to the Russian government. I have to say that all of these activities in Africa seem to me to reinforce that. They give me the impression that Prigozhin was actually trying to live up to his part of the bargain with Putin, that he was refocusing his and Wagner's efforts in Africa, and that he was intent from this point on in working again as a team player. Now, if that's so, and if the Russian authorities knew that, then that argues, at least to my mind, for the Russian authorities having no reason to be concerned about what Prigozhin was up to. Now, there is something else, which is that I've had a private email from Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism, and she has made an absolutely excellent point about Prigozhin, which is that if the Russian authorities had really wanted to remove Prigozhin from the scene and had wanted to discredit him, the obvious way to have done it would have been by bringing corruption charges. And there's an abundance of these corruption charges which could have been brought, and this fact that Prigozhin was apparently paid in gold by the Sudanese militia, well, that might quite easily have formed a part of that. And that now brings me to Putin's first comments about Prigozhin and his death, which since the crash, which Putin made over the course of a meeting with Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Russian-appointed regional government in Donetsk. And this is what, according to the Kremlin website, Putin said. Regarding the plane crash, first, I would like to express my sincere condolences to the families of all the victims. It is always a tragedy when it happens. Indeed, if Wagner members were on board, since this is what we know, judging by preliminary reports, I must say that these people made a meaningful contribution to our common cause to fight the neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine. We remember this, we know this, and we will never forget. I knew Prigozhin for a long time, since the early 1990s. By the way, in parenthesis, that is much longer than has been widely known up to this time. But anyway, that's what Putin says. I knew Prigozhin for a long time, since the early 1990s. He was a man of a difficult fate and made some serious mistakes in his life, but he also achieved the necessary results for himself and for the greater good when I asked him, as it happened over the past months. He was a talented man, a gifted business leader who worked in and outside our country, including in Africa, and was quite effective at that. He worked with oil, gas, precious metals and gemstones there. As far as I know, only yesterday he returned from Africa and had meetings with several officials. What I can tell you for sure, as the head of the investigative committee reported to me this morning, that's the Russian FBI equivalent, by the way, the investigative committee, a preliminary investigation into this incident has been launched. It will run its full course. There must be no doubt about that. Let us wait a little and see what the investigators tell us. A technical expertise and genetic tests are currently underway. This will take some time. Now, yesterday I received another private email from my old source inside Wagner. Well, he's not himself inside Wagner, but he has contacts inside Wagner. He confirms that all the people who have been named as the Wagner leadership group were indeed on that plane. He says that several of these were in fact serving officers of Russian military intelligence, of the GRU in other words, including Utkin, the leader, the military leader of Wagner. He was apparently a still serving GRU officer, which has not been disclosed before. And this source has also conveyed to me the fact that apparently Putin is taking a personal interest in the investigation and is receiving regular reports about it, and that information coming out of the investigation is first communicated to Putin before it is communicated to anyone else, which shows the very high importance Putin is attaching to this, frankly, politically difficult affair. But there is something else, and it comes from Putin's words. And we have in England an expression, to damn with faint praise. And I have to say that Putin's comments about Prigozhin, they're not quite as bad as that. They don't damn him with faint praise, but they're not unequivocally sympathetic to him either. And they do beg some questions about him. First of all, there's the way in which Putin refers to Prigozhin purely as a businessman. He's never referred to as a military leader. Well, of course, Prigozhin was not a military leader. He was a businessman, so that is accurate. But he was active in the capture of Bakhmut and Solidar and Popasnaya. And one would have thought there would be some more acknowledgement of his role in the victories which were achieved in those particular battles. And then note the way in the way in which it's emphasized that he achieved necessary results for himself and for the greater good when I asked him. In other words, Putin asked Prigozhin to do things, and that was for the greater good. But when Prigozhin was acting alone by himself, he achieved the necessary results for himself. It sort of implies that he was a fundamentally purely self-interested man. And then Putin says that Prigozhin worked with oil, gas, precious metals and gemstones, which might even hint that all those rumours about Prigozhin being involved in trade in blood diamonds and things of that kind, all of that might even have been true. There's a lot more nuance in Putin's words than I think some reports have acknowledged. One gets the sense that Putin has not forgotten or forgiven the events of last June, that he still considered Prigozhin to be a volatile, unpredictable, and ultimately selfish person, and that though he is prepared to acknowledge Prigozhin's real strengths and abilities, Putin is basically saying that those only achieved good results when Prigozhin was steered in that direction by someone like Putin himself. So, just saying all of this, but of course, coming back to Eve Smith's point, we see here that Putin himself is gently hinting, with all those reference to oil, gas, precious metals and gemstones, that if the Russian authorities had been minded to, the option of bringing some kind of corruption case against Prigozhin was there. I'm going to say straight away that I think that this idea that, if Prigozhin's plane fell from the skies, it was this theatrical event that would terrify the entire Russian elite into silence, whereas Prigozhin's murder off stage in Africa presumably would not have done. I have to say, I think that is absolute nonsense. How would the Russian authorities, if they'd intended to stage an event like that with those sort of consequences, have known in advance that the film of the crash would be as dramatic as it was? I still believe that this was something that the Russian authorities did not intend and did not plan, that it is more an embarrassment to them than anything else, and that probably this was a murder, but that the suspects should be searched for elsewhere. But anyway, I thought that would be interesting, and we see what Putin has to say about Prigozhin. Before I finish this program, one very last thing, again about the Prigozhin affair. Latest reports are that since the death of Prigozhin, there's a mass movement of Wagner fighters back towards Russia, and that they're now signing en masse contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry, resolving that issue. So Prigozhin's departure from the scene has finally achieved the objective the Russian Defense Ministry has always had, to absorb Wagner fully into the Russian Defense Ministry structures. I'm not saying that that was what brought about Prigozhin's death, but that seems to have been the effect. There's been all sorts of reports in the Western media about flesh-creeping threats supposedly made by Wagner officials to avenge Prigozhin's death. Can I say that the Western media, perhaps unknowingly, are repeating chatter on Telegram channels, which I understand have no actual full formal connection to Wagner or to Prigozhin. And a lot of this material that is being published has, to put it mildly, a doubtful provenance. In reality, Russia has reacted calmly to the news of Prigozhin's death, as, by the way, has Wagner. And it seems that the long-standing plan to roll Wagner into the Russian Defense Ministry structures is now being finally carried out. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. I look forward to you joining me again shortly. To remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. Remember, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop and get yourself all the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.